I found my grandfather dying in our garage, lying in his own filth next to an empty dog bowl. His lips were cracked and bleeding his body, so dehydrated that the paramedics said another few hours would have killed him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when he opened his eyes and that ambulance gripped my hand with what little strength he had left and whispered the name of the man who had locked him in there to die. Marcus, my father. If you think you know where the story is going, trust me, you don't. What started as elderly abuse unraveled into corporate fraud, manslaughter, and a conspiracy that nearly cost me my life. So before I tell you how I brought down my own father's empire, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me if you'd have the courage to do what I did. Because honestly, I still don't know if I was brave or just desperate. Now let me take you back to where it all began. 3 weeks before I found Grandpa Elias in that garage, I was on a business trip in New York, completely oblivious to the nightmare brewing back home in Miami. I worked as a senior analyst for a consulting firm, the kind of job that kept me traveling constantly and too busy to notice the cracks forming in my family. My father, Marcus Vance, was one of Miami's most prominent real estate developers. His face was on billboards across the city, his name synonymous with luxury high-rises and waterfront properties. Growing up as his daughter meant living in his shadow, always aware that his reputation mattered more than anything else in the world. My mother had died when I was 12, and after that it had always been just the three of us, Dad, Grandpa Elias, and me, except it wasn't really the three of us. Grandpa Elias had raised me more than my father ever did. While Dad was closing deals and schmoozing investors, Grandpa was the one teaching me to ride a bike, helping with homework, and sitting with me when I cried about my mother. He was a retired accountant, quiet and meticulous, with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He'd moved in with us after Mom died, and our house in the Miami suburbs had been his home for over 15 years. I should have known something was wrong when Dad started talking about moving Grandpa to a facility. It started subtly, little comments here and there. Grandpa's getting forgetful, Alara. He left the stove on twice last week. I think he needs professional care. But Grandpa Elias was 78 and sharp as ever. Sure, he moved a bit slower, but his mind was clear. I pushed back every time Dad brought it up, and eventually he seemed to drop it. I thought I'd won. I thought I'd protected him. I was so incredibly wrong. When I got home from New York on that Tuesday evening in late September, the house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. It was too quiet. Grandpa always had the television on in the living room, watching his history documentaries or the evening news. But that night there was nothing, just an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I called out for him as I dropped my suitcase in the entryway. No response. I checked his bedroom, the bathroom, the back porch where he liked to sit and read. Nothing. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from the garage. My heart started pounding as I walked toward the door that connected the house to the garage. The knob was locked, which was strange because we never locked that door. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking for reasons I couldn't explain yet. When I finally got the door open and flipped on the light, the scene before me made my legs buckle. Grandpa Elias was lying on the concrete floor, barely conscious, his clothes soaked with urine. His lips were so dry they'd cracked open in several places, blood caked at the corners of his mouth. Next to him was one of our old dog bowls from when we had a German Shepherd years ago. It was empty, bone dry, with scratch marks around the inside, like he'd been licking every last drop. The garage was sweltering, the floor to heat, having turned it into an oven. The smell of human waste and desperation hit me like a physical blow. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because neighbors later told me they heard it. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him, afraid I'd hurt him more. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Grandpa?" I said, my voice breaking. "Grandpa, what happened? Who did this to you?" I had my phone out, was already dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice seemed to come from very far away as I tried to answer her questions. "Yes, he's breathing. No, I don't know how long he's been here. Please, please hurry." The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but it felt like hours. They worked quickly, efficiently, hooking him up to an IV, checking his vitals, loading him onto a stretcher. I heard fragments of their conversation: severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, acute kidney stress, possible organ failure. In the ambulance, as we raced toward Miami General Hospital, Grandpa's hand suddenly shot out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that cut through his delirium. Marcus, he rasped his voice like sandpaper. It was Marcus, your father, he did this. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond to tell him he must be confused, that there had to be some mistake, but his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again. The paramedic gently pried his fingers off my wrist and went back to monitoring his vitals, and I sat there in that ambulance, my mind reeling, unable to process what I'd just heard. At the hospital, doctors swarmed around Grandpa the moment we arrived. I was pushed aside left to stand in the hallway while they rushed him into the emergency room. A nurse came out after what felt like forever and led me to a private waiting room. That's when Dr. Patricia Chen, the attending physician, came to talk to me. She was a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and the kind of gentle directness that comes from years of delivering bad news. She sat down across from me and folded her hands in her lap. Your grandfather is stable for now, she said. But Ms. Vance, I need you to understand the severity of his condition. He's suffering from acute kidney injury due to severe dehydration and heat exposure. His body temperature was dangerously elevated when he arrived. Another few hours in those conditions and we wouldn't have been able to save him. The words landed like stones in my chest. Another few hours. I'd almost lost him. If I'd come home even a little bit later, if my flight had been delayed, if I'd stopped for dinner on the way from the airport. How long, I managed to ask, my throat tight. How long was he like that? Dr. Chen's expression grew even more somber. Based on his level of dehydration and the state of his body, I'd estimate at least 48 to 72 hours, possibly longer. 3 days. Someone had left my grandfather locked in a garage for 3 days without water in Miami's brutal September heat. I need to ask you some questions, Dr. Chen continued, and her tone made me look up sharply. This kind of neglect, especially given your grandfather's condition when he arrived, raises serious concerns. Does your grandfather live alone? No, I said quickly. He lives with my father. I was away on a business trip. I just got back tonight. And your father? I don't know. I haven't been able to reach him yet. That was a lie. I hadn't tried to reach him, because somewhere in my gut I knew. Grandpa's words in the ambulance kept echoing in my head. Marcus did this. Dr. Chen looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her making calculations, deciding how much to say. Ms. Vance, I'm required by law to report cases of suspected elder abuse to Adult Protective Services. Given the circumstances of your grandfather's condition and how we found him, I have to make that call. I nodded numbly. She squeezed my hand briefly before leaving me alone in that sterile waiting room. I sat there for a long time staring at my phone before I finally pulled up my father's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice smooth and unconcerned. Elara, sweetheart, you're back from New York. How was the trip? The casualness of his tone made rage bubble up in my chest. Where are you? I said flatly. At the office, finishing up some paperwork for the Vance Tower project. Why, what's wrong? Grandpa is in the hospital. I found him locked in the garage. There was a pause, but it was too short, too controlled. What, is he okay? What happened? You tell me, Dad, what happened? Elara. I have no idea what you're talking about. Is Elias all right? His use of Grandpa's first name, the distant concern in his voice, it all felt so calculated, so false. I need you to come to Miami General, I said. Now. Of course I'll be right there. He hung up, and I sat there, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. But I kept seeing Grandpa's face in the ambulance, the absolute certainty in his eyes when he said Marcus did this. My father arrived 45 minutes later, striding into the hospital in his expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression a mask of appropriate concern. He hugged me, and I stood stiff in his embrace, unable to respond. What happened? He asked, and I noticed how he asked me, not the doctors. As if I was the source of information, not someone he should be explaining things to. I found him in the garage, I said, watching his face carefully. He'd been locked in there for days, Dad. Days, without water, in that heat. Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to name, before the concern smoothly slid back into place. Locked in? That doesn't make sense. Elias must have gotten confused and locked himself in somehow. You know he's been getting more forgetful lately. No, I said sharply. He hasn't, and he didn't lock himself in. Someone locked him in there. Elara, you're upset. You've had a shock. Let's wait to hear what the doctors say before we jump to conclusions. He said your name, Dad, in the ambulance. He said you did this to him. My father's face went very still. Then he laughed a short, dismissive sound. He was delirious, Elara. The man was dying of dehydration. You can't take seriously what he said in that state. Before I could respond, Dr. Chen appeared with a police officer. Ms. Vance, this is Officer Rodriguez. He's here to take a statement about the circumstances under which you found your grandfather. The next hour was a blur of questions and answers. I told them everything. The locked door, the dog bowl. Grandpa's condition, what he'd said in the ambulance. My father sat beside me, the picture of a concerned son and father, occasionally interjecting with comments about Grandpa's supposed forgetfulness, and his own worry about his father's declining mental state. Officer Rodriguez was professional, but non-committal. We'll investigate, he assured me. Adult Protective Services will be conducting their own inquiry as well. After he left, my father turned to me, and for the first time, I saw something cold in his eyes. Ilara, he said quietly, I understand you're scared and upset, but you need to be very careful about the accusations you're making. Our family has a reputation in this city. False allegations could damage that significantly. They're not false allegations, I said. They're questions. Questions that need answers. He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. I'm going to check on Elias, he said. And then I suggest you go home and get some rest. You're not thinking clearly right now. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me sitting alone in that waiting room, my hands clenched into fists. I didn't go home that night. I stayed at the hospital, curled up in an uncomfortable chair beside Grandpa's bed in the ICU. They'd stabilized him, but he remained unconscious, his body working to recover from the trauma it had endured. I held his hand and watched the monitors, the steady beep, beep, beep of his heartbeat, the only thing keeping me grounded. Somewhere around 3 a.m, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. The sender was a blank email address, just a string of random numbers and letters. No subject line. I opened it and my blood ran cold. It was a single photograph. Me earlier that evening, standing in the hospital hallway talking to Dr. Chen. The angle suggested it had been taken from somewhere down the corridor, zoomed in on my face. There was no message, no text, just that photograph. But the meaning was crystal clear. We're watching you. My hand started shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I looked up, scanning the hallway visible through the window of Grandpa's room, but saw only nurses at their station and the dim overnight lighting. Whoever had taken that photo could be anywhere, could be here right now. I wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? I received a creepy email. They'd tell me to forward it to their cybercrime division and fill out a report online. Meanwhile, whoever sent it would still be out there watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. By the time dawn broke and the day shift nurses arrived, I was exhausted and wired with adrenaline in equal measure. Grandpa woke up around 9 that morning. His eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition when he saw me. His lips moved, trying to form words. Don't try to talk, I said, squeezing his hand gently. You're in the hospital. You're safe now. But he gripped my hand tighter, his eyes urgent. He kept trying to speak, his voice a bare whisper. I leaned in close to hear him. Marcus, he rasped. Has to be stopped. Papers. In my room. Hidden. What papers, Grandpa? What are you talking about? But the effort had exhausted him, and his eyes drifted closed again. A nurse came in to check his vitals and gently suggested I go home and get some rest. Your grandfather needs time to recover, she said kindly. You being here won't speed that up, and you look like you're about to collapse yourself. Reluctantly, I left the hospital. But I didn't go to my apartment in Coral Gables. I drove to the house in the suburbs, the house where I'd grown up, where I'd found Grandpa dying just last night. The house that my father also had keys to. The thought of going inside made my skin crawl, but I had to know what Grandpa meant about papers in his room. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment staring at the house. It looked so normal, so peaceful in the morning sunlight. The lawn was perfectly manicured courtesy of the landscaping service Dad employed. The paint was fresh, the windows gleaming. From the outside, you'd never know what horrors had happened here. I let myself in through the front door and immediately smelled cleaning chemicals. Someone had been here. The house was spotless, the floors gleaming, every surface wiped down. The door to the garage stood open, and when I looked inside, I saw that it too had been thoroughly cleaned. The dog bowl was gone. Any evidence of what had happened here had been scrubbed away. My father's work, obviously, destroying evidence. The rage that had been simmering in my chest since last night flared hot and bright. I went upstairs to Grandpa's room. It was a large space at the back of the house filled with his books and photographs, his reading chair by the window, his collection of old vinyl records. I'd spent countless hours here as a child, listening to his stories, learning about history and music and life. Now I stood in the doorway and tried to think like Grandpa. Where would he hide papers that he didn't want anyone to find? I started with the obvious places. Desk drawers, the filing cabinet under the mattress. Nothing. Then I moved to the less obvious spots. Behind picture frames, inside book covers, in the pockets of clothes hanging in the closet. Still nothing. I was starting to lose hope when my eye fell on his bookshelf. Grandpa had hundreds of books meticulously organized, but there was one section that looked slightly off, a gap between two books that was just a bit too wide. I reached in and pulled out the book on the left. It was a thick hardcover, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, one of his favorites. But when I opened it, I found that the pages had been hollowed out, creating a small cavity inside. And nestled in that cavity was a USB drive. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. It was just a simple black thumb drive, but I knew instinctively that whatever was on it was important enough that Grandpa had hidden it like this. Important enough that he'd tried to tell me about it even while barely conscious in a hospital bed. I pocketed the USB drive and left the house quickly, that feeling of being watched crawling up my spine again. I drove back to my apartment, checking my rearview mirror constantly for cars that might be following me. I was probably being paranoid, but after that email last night, paranoid seemed like the only sane response. Back in my apartment, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before I sat down at my laptop and inserted the USB drive. There were dozens of files on it. PDFs, spreadsheets, scanned documents. My heart racing, I started opening them. What I found made everything click into place with horrifying clarity. These weren't documents about a loan. They were evidence of massive corporate fraud. Grandpa, with his accountant's eye and his methodical nature, had been investigating my father. It started with a shell company called Meridian Holdings, LLC. According to the documents, Meridian had purchased a 15-acre parcel of land in Brickell for an absurdly low price 2 years ago. That land was now the site of Vance Tower, my father's most ambitious project to date. A luxury residential high-rise that was supposed to cement his legacy as one of Miami's premier developers. But as I dug deeper into Grandpa's files, I discovered why that land had been so cheap. It had previously been an industrial site home to a chemical processing plant that had operated from the 1950s through the early 2000s. The soil was contaminated with heavy metals, PCBs, and God knows what else. It would have cost tens of millions of dollars to properly remediate. Instead, according to these documents, my father had done a cursory and completely inadequate cleanup, then buried the contamination reports. He'd bribed the environmental inspector, paid off city officials, and falsified testing results. Vance Tower was being built on poisoned ground, and nobody knew except him and the people he'd paid to look the other way. But it got worse, much worse. I found a series of emails between my father and someone named Julian Reeves, who appeared to be some kind of fixer. In these emails, they discussed an incident that had occurred during the early stages of construction. A worker named Carlos Mendoza had become sick on the job site, very sick. He'd been rushed to the hospital with severe respiratory distress and neurological symptoms. He died 3 days later. The official story, according to the documents, was that Carlos had an undiagnosed heart condition and his death was ruled as natural causes. But Grandpa had found the original autopsy report, the one that had somehow disappeared from official records. Carlos Mendoza had died from acute exposure to neurotoxic chemicals, the same chemicals that were supposed to have been cleaned up from that land. My father hadn't just covered up corporate fraud, he'd covered up a man's death. Manslaughter, at minimum possibly criminally negligent homicide. And then I found the final piece of the puzzle. An email from Grandpa to someone at the EPA dated 3 weeks ago, just before I left for New York. In it, he explained what he'd discovered and said he was prepared to turn over all his evidence. He asked for a meeting to discuss how to proceed. My father must have found out. Maybe he'd been monitoring Grandpa's email, or maybe someone at the EPA was on his payroll too. Either way, he'd known that Grandpa was about to destroy him, so he'd gotten rid of the problem, locked his own father in a garage to die, made it look like the tragic result of an old man's confused wandering. If I hadn't come home when I did, Grandpa would be dead, and everyone would have believed it was an accident. I sat back from my laptop, my whole body shaking. This was so much bigger than I'd imagined. My father wasn't just guilty of elder abuse. He was a murderer, and he tried to kill his own father to cover it up. I needed help. I needed someone who could take this evidence and do something with it, someone my father couldn't threaten or buy off. I pulled up Google on my laptop and searched for investigative journalists in Miami. Several names came up, but one caught my attention. Nina Reyes, a reporter for the Miami Herald, who'd won awards for her exposés on corruption and white-collar crime. I found her email on the Herald's website and spent the next hour crafting a message. I explained who I was, what had happened to my grandfather, and what I'd found on the USB drive. I attached several of the most damning documents. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I hit send. Her response came faster than I expected. Less than 2 hours later, my phone rang with an unknown number. "Is this Alara Vance?" a woman's voice asked when I answered. "Yes, is this Nina Reyes?" "It is. I just read your email and looked at the documents you sent. Are you somewhere safe right now?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm at my apartment." "Why?" "Because if what you're telling me is true, you've just made yourself a target. The man you're accusing your father, he has a lot of money and a lot of connections. People like that don't take exposure lying down." "I know," I said quietly, thinking of the email with my photograph. "I need to see all of the evidence," Nina continued. "And I need to verify it independently. But Ms. Vance, if even half of this checks out, this is one of the biggest stories I've ever worked on. Corporate fraud, bribery, environmental crimes, and a covered-up death. This could bring down your father's entire empire." "Good," I said fiercely. "That's exactly what needs to happen." We arranged to meet that evening at a coffee shop in Coconut Grove, somewhere public, with lots of people around. I spent the rest of the afternoon copying all of Grandpa's files to a separate backup drive and uploading everything to a secure cloud storage. If something happened to the USB drive, or to me, the evidence would still exist. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone rang. My father's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Alara," he said, and his voice was different now. The smooth charm was gone, replaced by something harder. "We need to talk." "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I said. "Oh, I think we do. I heard from your office today. Apparently you've been put on administrative leave pending a performance review. Seems there have been some concerns about the quality of your work lately." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I made some phone calls this morning to some people I know at your firm. Explained that you've been under a lot of stress lately, making wild accusations about your family, clearly not thinking straight. They agreed that maybe you need some time off, maybe some professional help." The implications hit me like a freight train. He was trying to destroy my credibility, make me look unstable. If I came forward with accusations against him, he wanted everyone to think I was having some kind of breakdown. "You can't do this," I said, but my voice came out weak. "I can do whatever I need to do to protect this family," he said coldly. "And right now that means protecting us from you. Drop this, Alara. Go visit Elias, tell him you love him, and let this whole unfortunate incident fade away. If you do that, I'll make sure your job situation gets sorted out. We can all move on. And if I don't, then you'll find out just how much I can make your life difficult. You're my daughter, and I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you force my hand." He hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my apartment phone clutched in my shaking hand, understanding fully for the first time what I was up against. My father wasn't just going to let this go. He was going to fight back with everything he had. I almost didn't go to meet Nina that night. The smart thing, the safe thing would have been to back down, take the loss, keep my head down, let my father win. But every time I considered it, I saw Grandpa lying on that garage floor. I saw Carlos Mendoza's widow, whoever she was, grieving a death that was written off as natural causes. I saw the hundreds of people who would eventually live in Vance Tower, unknowingly residing above contaminated soil. I went to the coffee shop. Nina Reyes was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of barely contained energy. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a view of the door. She stood when she saw me, and we shook hands. "You look terrified," she said bluntly as we sat down. "I am," I admitted. "My father called me this afternoon. He got me suspended from my job. He knows I'm digging into this." Nina's expression grew serious. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Once we start pulling this thread, there's no going back. Your relationship with your father will be destroyed. You might lose more than just your job." I thought about it, really thought about it. Then I pulled the USB drive from my bag and slid it across the table. "My relationship with my father is already destroyed," I said. "The man I thought he was never existed. I want to know everything, and I want everyone else to know it too." Nina picked up the USB drive and studied it for a moment. Then she looked at me with something like respect. "Okay," she said, "let's burn it all down." Over the next week, Nina and I worked together like partners in a crime drama. She was thorough and relentless, verifying every piece of evidence Grandpa had collected and digging up even more. She found the real autopsy report for Carlos Mendoza, hidden in the medical examiner's archives. She tracked down the environmental inspector who'd been paid off and convinced him to go on record. She obtained internal emails from Meridian Holdings that proved my father's connection to the shell company. But while we were building our case, my father was escalating his attacks on me. It started small. My credit cards were suddenly declined. When I called the bank, they said my accounts had been flagged for suspicious activity and frozen pending an investigation. I knew my father had connections in banking. This was his doing. Then my car started acting strange. The brakes felt spongy, less responsive. I took it to a mechanic, and he showed me the brake lines. Someone had tampered with them, creating a slow leak. Another few days, and I would have had complete brake failure. I should have been able to drive, the mechanic said, frowning. This looks deliberate. That was the moment I understood my father wasn't just trying to discredit me anymore. He was trying to kill me. I moved out of my apartment and into a cheap motel under a fake name. I paid in cash and parked my car several blocks away. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. The photograph from the hospital kept haunting me. Someone was watching, someone was always watching. It was Julian Reeves, I learned, the fixer from the emails. Nina had done some digging on him and discovered he had a record. Assault, intimidation, criminal mischief. He was essentially my father's personal enforcer, the man who made problems disappear. One night, about 10 days after I found Grandpa in the garage, I made a mistake. I went back to my apartment to get some clothes and personal items. I thought I was being careful. I thought I'd timed it right, going late at night when I was sure no one would be there. I was wrong. I'd just finished packing a bag when I heard the sound of my front door opening. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I'd locked that door. I knew I had. Heavy footsteps moved through my living room, heading toward the bedroom where I stood. I looked around frantically for a weapon, for anything I could use to defend myself. My hand closed around a heavy glass vase on my dresser. The bedroom door swung open, and a large man filled the doorway. He was in his 40s, built like a linebacker with cold eyes and a predatory smile. Julian Reeves. I'd seen his photo in Nina's research. "Ms. Vance," he said pleasantly, like we were old friends meeting for coffee. "Your father sent me to have a chat with you." "Get out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get out or I'm calling the police." He laughed, pulling out his phone and holding it up. "No, you're not. Because if you do, I'll make one phone call, and something very unfortunate will happen to your grandfather in that hospital." Amazing how easy it is to slip into the ICU when you know which nurses are amenable to a little extra cash. The threat made my blood run ice cold. "What do you want?" "The USB drive," he said, taking a step into the room. "The one you took from the old man's room. And any copies you've made. Give them to me and everyone stays safe. Your grandfather, your journalist friend, you. Everyone goes home happy." "I don't have it," I lied. "I gave it to the police." His smile vanished. "Wrong answer." He lunged at me faster than a man his size should have been able to move. I swung the vase with all my strength, catching him in the temple. Glass shattered, and he stumbled back, blood streaming down the side of his face. But he didn't go down. He roared with rage and came at me again. I dodged past him, running for the bedroom door, but he caught my arm and yanked me back. I screamed, driving my elbow into his face. I felt his nose crunch under the impact, and his grip loosened just enough for me to tear free. I ran. Out of the bedroom, through the living room, grabbing my car keys on the way. He was right behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding, blood dripping on my carpet. I made it to the front door and threw it open, just as his hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun and kicked him as hard as I could between the legs. He went down with a gasping wheeze, and I didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. I sprinted down the hallway, took the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator, and burst out into the parking garage. My car was 3 levels down, and I ran the whole way, my lungs burning, expecting to hear him behind me at any moment. I made it to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine started, and I peeled out of the parking garage, tires squealing. Only when I was several blocks away, stopped at a red light, with my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, did I realize I was sobbing. I called Nina from my car, told her what happened. She picked me up from a gas station and took me to her apartment. "We need to go to the police," she insisted. "File a report about the break-in and the assault." But I knew better. I told them, and Julian would disappear. My father would lawyer up, claim it was all a misunderstanding. And meanwhile, that threat about Grandpa still hung over me. "We have to move faster," I said. We have to take him down before he takes us down. Nina nodded slowly. I think I know how, she said. There's a press conference scheduled for next week. Your father is announcing the completion of Vance Tower. He's invited the mayor, city council members, major investors. It's going to be a huge media event. She looked at me with fierce determination. We're going to hijack it. We're going to expose everything in front of all those cameras, all those witnesses. He won't be able to silence us if the whole world is watching. The plan was audacious, possibly insane, but it might be our only shot. Over the next few days, Nina finished verifying the last of our evidence. She also reached out to Carlos Mendoza's family. His widow Sofia still lived in Miami with their 2 teenage children. When Nina explained what had really happened to Carlos, why he'd really died, Sofia broke down in tears. She'd always known the official story didn't make sense, but she'd had no way to prove it. Now she wanted justice for her husband. Nina interviewed her, recorded her statement, got permission to use Carlos's story. It was the human element that would make this real for people watching. Not just corporate fraud and environmental crimes, but a man who'd been killed and then erased to protect my father's bottom line. The night before the press conference, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in Nina's guest room thinking about what was coming. By this time tomorrow, my father would either be in handcuffs or I'd be the one facing legal consequences for defamation. There was no middle ground. I thought about calling him. I'm not sure why. Maybe to give him one last chance to come clean, to do the right thing. Maybe just to hear his voice before I destroyed him. But in the end, I didn't. There was nothing left to say. The press conference was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the Vance Tower construction site. A stage had been set up with a podium and a massive screen behind it, showing architects' renderings of the finished building. Rows of chairs faced the stage, already filling up with reporters, city officials, and investors. My father had spared no expense. This was supposed to be his triumph, his moment of glory. Nina had press credentials so she could walk right in. I was more complicated. I couldn't exactly stroll up to the front where my father would see me, so we planned it carefully. I would wait in the crowd, just another face in the audience. Nina would ask her question at the right moment, and that would be my cue. I wore sunglasses and a baseball cap, trying to be invisible, as I found a spot toward the back. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought everyone around me must be able to hear it. I scanned the crowd and spotted my father near the stage, laughing with the mayor, the picture of confidence and success in his $1,000 suit. At exactly 10, he took the podium. The crowd quieted, cameras focused, and he began his speech. Thank you all for being here today, he said, his voice booming across the construction site. 5 years ago, I had a vision of a building that would not only change Miami's skyline, but also represent the best of what our city can be. Luxury, innovation, sustainability. Vance Tower embodies all of these values. He went on like that, talking about architectural awards and green building certifications and economic impact. I felt sick listening to him lie so smoothly, but I waited, forcing myself to be patient. After about 10 minutes, he opened the floor to questions. Several reporters asked softball questions about unit prices and move-in dates. Then Nina raised her hand. Nina Reyes, Miami Herald, she said when he called on her. Mr. Vance, I have a question about the land acquisition for this project, specifically about Meridian Holdings and the environmental history of this site. I saw my father's expression flicker just for a second before the smooth mask slid back into place. I'm not sure what you mean, he said carefully. Nina continued standing up so everyone could see her, that this land was previously an industrial site contaminated with toxic chemicals. I mean that the remediation done here was inadequate and fraudulent. And I mean that a construction worker named Carlos Mendoza died from exposure to those same chemicals, and his death was covered up to protect this project. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. My father's face went pale, then flushed red. That's an outrageous accusation, he said, his voice hard. I don't know what your agenda is, Ms. Reyes, but I won't stand here and be slandered. That was my cue. I pushed my way through the crowd, pulling off my sunglasses and cap. People turned to look as I approached the stage, and I saw the moment my father recognized me. His eyes widened, then narrowed with fury. It's not slander if it's true, I shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. I had reached the steps to the stage now, and before security could stop me, I ran up and grabbed one of the spare microphones. And it is true. My father built his empire on lies. He poisoned this land, he killed a man and covered it up. And when my grandfather tried to expose him, he locked him in a garage and left him to die. The crowd was in chaos now, reporters shouting questions, security trying to reach me. cameras swinging wildly to capture everything. The mayor was on his feet looking between me and my father with shocked confusion. "This is my daughter," my father said into his microphone, trying to regain control. "She's been under a great deal of stress lately, suffering from delusions. She needs help, not a platform for her fantasies." But Nina was ready. At her signal, the large screen behind the podium, the one that had been showing those beautiful renderings of Vance Tower, suddenly changed. It started displaying the evidence. Scanned documents proving the connection between Marcus Vance and Meridian Holdings. Environmental reports showing the extent of the contamination. The original autopsy report for Carlos Mendoza. Email exchanges discussing the cover-up. And then in the final devastating blow, the screen showed a video. Sofia Mendoza sitting in her living room, tears streaming down her face, talking about her husband. About how he'd come home from work that day feeling sick. About how he died in the hospital while doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. About how she'd been paid off and told to keep quiet, told that if she made trouble, she'd lose even that small settlement. "My husband was a good man," Sofia said on that video, her voice breaking. "He worked hard to provide for our family. He deserved better than to be poisoned and then forgotten. Marcus Vance took him from us, and then he tried to make it like Carlos never mattered at all." The screen went dark. The construction site was absolutely silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters. Every eye was on my father, who stood frozen at the podium, his face ashen. Then the police arrived. Nina had coordinated with them, given them all the evidence beforehand. They'd been waiting for this moment, for the public exposure that would make it impossible for anyone to bury this case. "Marcus Vance," one of the officers said, "mounting the stage, you're under arrest for fraud, bribery, criminal negligence, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent." My father looked at me as they handcuffed him. The expression on his face was one I'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but something like disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that his own daughter had brought him down. I stared back at him, refusing to look away, refusing to feel guilty. This wasn't a daughter betraying her father. This was someone finally holding a monster accountable for his crimes. They led him away, and the press conference dissolved into pandemonium. Reporters were shouting questions at me, at Nina, at the police. The mayor was being hustled away by his staff. Investors were on their phones, probably calling their lawyers. Security was trying to clear the area. Nina found me in the chaos, grabbed my arm. "We need to go," she said, "now while we still can." We pushed through the crowd to her car and drove away, leaving Vance Tower standing unfinished behind us, a monument to my father's hubris and crimes. The next week was a blur. The story exploded across local and national news. Nina's reporting won immediate acclaim, and other journalists started digging into my father's business dealings, finding more irregularities and potential crimes. The FBI launched an investigation into the bribery and fraud charges. The EPA announced they were testing the soil at the Vance Tower site and several other properties my father had developed. Julian Reeves was arrested trying to leave the country. He cut a deal testifying against my father in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony confirmed everything we'd alleged and added details we hadn't known about other crimes, other cover-ups. My father's legal team tried every trick in the book. But there was too much evidence, too many witnesses, too much public scrutiny. The trial lasted 3 months, and I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with Sofia Mendoza and her children. We'd become friends, bonded by our shared experience of being victimized by the same man. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced my father to 25 years in prison. He was 62 years old. He'd likely die behind bars. I didn't feel triumphant when they led him away. I didn't feel happy. I just felt tired and sad and relieved that it was finally over. Grandpa Elias made a full recovery, though it took months of rehabilitation. His kidneys had been permanently damaged, and he'd need medication for the rest of his life, but he was alive. That was what mattered. He moved in with me in a small house I bought in Coral Gables, with a garden where he could grow roses. He never talked much about what my father had done to him, but sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window with a sad, distant expression, and I knew he was thinking about the son he'd raised, wondering where it had all gone wrong. I used some of the money from selling my father's properties, which came to me in his estate, to set up a foundation for victims of corporate negligence. We helped families like the Mendoza's, people who'd been hurt by companies cutting corners and covering up their crimes. Nina joined the board, bringing her investigative skills to help uncover other cases of wrongdoing. Vance Tower was demolished. The city determined that the contamination was too extensive to safely remediate. and the structure that was already built had to come down. The land was turned into a memorial park dedicated to Carlos Mendoza and other workers who'd been killed in workplace incidents. 6 months after my father's conviction, I sat in that memorial park on a bench next to the plaque with Carlos's name on it. It was early evening, the Miami sun setting over the bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grandpa was at home, probably tending to his roses. Nina was at work chasing her next big story. And I was here, finally able to breathe without that weight of secrecy and fear crushing my chest. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Her daughter had just been accepted to college on a full scholarship. The foundation we'd set up had helped with the application process and essay coaching. She sent me a photo of Maria smiling and holding her acceptance letter, and I found myself smiling too. This, I thought, was what legacy really meant. Not buildings with your name on them, not wealth and power and prestige, but the impact you have on real people's lives. The courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. I'd lost my father, though. The truth was, I'd lost him long before that day in the garage. The man I'd thought he was had never existed. But I'd gained something too. I'd gained the knowledge that I was strong enough to fight back against impossible odds, that I could look at injustice and not turn away, that I valued my integrity more than comfort or family loyalty. The sun dipped below the horizon and the park lights flickered on. I stood up from the bench, took one last look at Carlos's name engraved in bronze, and walked toward my car. Tomorrow I had a meeting with another family who needed help, another case of corporate malfeasance that needed exposing. The work was never done, but I was ready for it. Because true legacy isn't about what you build. It's about having the courage to tear down what's wrong, even when doing so tears your own life apart. And it's about rebuilding something better from the rubble. So I ask you, what would you do if you discovered that someone you loved, someone you trusted completely, had been living a lie? Would you have the courage to expose them, knowing it would cost you everything? Would you choose justice over family, truth over comfort? These aren't easy questions, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. But I know what I chose, and I'd make the same choice again. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships and the compromises you make, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me about a time you had to make a hard choice between loyalty and doing what was right. Let's start a conversation, because these stories, difficult as they are, need to be told. Justice is possible even when it seems impossible. Sometimes you just have to be willing to burn your whole world down to see it done.